I'd like to thank the organizers for asking me on behalf of the European Chemicals Agency to talk about what it is that we're doing in terms of microplastics at this very first World Plastics Summit. To start out with, the way we've been asked to do this work is through the European Commission, who requested us to look into whether there's a need or not to restrict intentionally added microplastics in consumer and other goods. And basically, we started with a definition, and we see them as solid particles of synthetic polymer, smaller than 5 millimeters in diameter. What we observed very quickly in our assessment is that microplastics are actually found almost everywhere in the environment, and that humans are also exposed to them from multiple routes. It be air, it be via our food or other exposures, the dust in our houses. Now, our assessment concentrates mainly on environment, not on the human health angle. The Commission's scientific advice mechanism has looked at the human health part, so I would refer you to the reports coming from them on human health effects. And we looked at all the uses that we could identify of microplastics and looked at the total impact on the environment and basically conclude that there is a concern. First of all, our assessment of where these microplastics exist is that we found them, or we found evidence that they're used in a multiplicity of products. And this ranges from fertilizers to plant protection products. They are found in cosmetics, in detergents, in various maintenance products. They are found in paints, coatings, and inks. They're used in the oil and gas industry, and they're also used in construction products, in construction industry, for example, to reinforce concrete, but also as components of adhesives. They're used in the health sector for medicinal products, in medical devices, and we also find them in certain targeted medical foods. And finally, we find them in food supplements. And all these uses, to higher or lower degree, give rise to emissions into the environment. And basically, what we see is that when the microplastics gets into the environment, they can be transferred up the food chain. This means they are taken in by one organism who then gets eaten by another organism, and then the microplastic stays within the organism. So there's a transfer up the food chain, which includes ultimately humans who also eat animals. But the indications from the scientific results that we have is definitely there is a concern. What's more is from these studies, we're not able to identify what is a safe level of exposure. And what that means is that we took the approach which is similar to the approach used in chemicals legislation generally for persistent bioaccumulative and toxic substances. And that is, rather than trying to, or based on a safe level, we identify what needs to be done to reduce the emissions to that safe level. We basically look at emissions overall and say, how can we minimize overall emissions into the environment? And that's been our assessment approach. Again, our restrictions proposal does not cover human health effects. And ultimately, what we see is that there's approximately 50,000 tons of microplastics intentionally used in these types of products. And of the 50,000 tons, about 36,000 tons end up in the environment, with 6,000 tons from cosmetic products, which have today alternatives. So that sets a bit the scene in terms of the exposure route into the environment, the tonnages in the environment, and why we believe there is a concern based on scientific evidence on environmental species. So we propose that there's a need to take action, and that action is to reduce the emissions into the environment of microplastics. And our proposal is effectively to have immediate bans for all those products where there are immediately alternatives to be implemented. And this is concerns in particular cosmetics and detergents. For the rest of the uses, we are proposing to give sufficient time to identify alternatives and implement them, but doing so without unnecessarily delaying emission reduction. And that's these 30,000 tons of microplastics which gets emitted every year. So clearly, due to the persistence of microplastics, the fact that once they're out there in the environment, they stay for decades, then every year that we wait with a specific ban, 30,000 tons more of the plastics ends up in the environment. There's also a number of areas where we know very little about the use of microplastics. So our proposal for a restriction also includes obligations to notify to the European Chemical Agency uses of such microplastics so that we can at a later stage assess them and maybe propose a need to reflect or to limit emissions. Finally, what are the next steps in this? Well, this report that I've basically outlined is one which we, meaning the Secretariat and I of the European Chemicals Agency, have prepared. We've submitted them to our two committees, scientific committees. One is called the Risk Assessment Committee, the other the Socioeconomic Analysis Committee, for their assessment and opinion. And once they've produced an opinion, then our restrictions proposal, together with our opinions coming from the committees, will be sent to the Commission for them to assess and decide whether, indeed, based on our scientific and technical assessment, action will be necessary and should be taken. Timeline-wise, we should finish our work this year and into the beginning of next year, and then send the package in the course of 2020 to the Commission for their decision-making. There's also been, in the discussions on our proposed restriction on microplastics, the question of, is the precautionary principle, should we invoke the precautionary principle or not? And I think our position in terms of applying the precautionary principle is that clearly following the Commission communication on the implementation of it, this is a policy decision which is for the Commission to take. But our duty and our role in the precautionary principle is to lay clearly, open and transparently in our work what we think of the uncertainties. And that's definitely what we've done in our report here. And we definitely explain in our assessment the uncertainties around that concern and the fact that we can't quantify exactly what would be a safe limit and what wouldn't. So that's all in there. And therefore, for the Commission, in its wisdom, to use that information to decide on further action, including whether or not to apply the precautionary principle. And finally, I think also just to set out the maybe somewhat broader context of polymers and plastics in the context of REACH itself. REACH principally does cover polymers. It's just that the registration requirements in REACH do not. Polymers are exempt from registration in REACH, but the other parts of REACH, in particular restrictions and authorization, principally do cover polymers. And that's exactly why we're able to do a restriction proposal under REACH, because polymers are fully covered in the restrictions part. And we have had quite a lot of other activities involving polymers, but normally looking at the chemicals inside the polymers, for example, phthalates or certain brominated flame retardants. And there we've also made a number of proposals for restricting such chemicals in plastics, which the Commission have taken and implemented as EU-wide restrictions. So I think that's hopefully gives an outline and a bit of a snapshot in terms of what we have done in the European Chemicals Agency, both within our restrictions proposal on microplastics, but also a little bit more in the broader context of plastics and plasticizers and other chemicals in plastics, and given you a bit of an outlook of the timeline as to when we will finish our scientific work and when it's over to the Commission for them to assess the work that we have done and decide whether there actually is a need within the Union to restrict these substances. With that, I'd like to thank you very, very much and wish you all a very productive and very interesting summit.